Right. Hello, welcome. We're going to be talking today about clean architecture with .NET 10. Everybody here okay? I know we've had audio issues in the past. Should be good without those. Okay. So today we're going to be talking about clean architecture with .NET 10, specifically talking about the clean architecture templates from Ardalis. And yes, templates, plural. Some things to note. I'm going to go off the screen and just go to laptop. All right. So when we're talking about clean architecture, something to note is that this is not a one-size-fits-all architecture. In reality, none of the architectures out there are one-size-fits-all. That doesn't make sense because different apps have different reasons to be, and so yeah, clean architecture does have its situations where it may make sense. However, there are also times where it might be too much. Clean architecture can be such a hot topic between people, and I'm like, why? The thing is, it's an architecture. You want to know where it's good and where it's not good, and use it accordingly. We're going to cover both situations. So I'm going to show you some situations where you don't want to use clean architecture, and then some other situations where clean architecture should be considered. Something else to keep in mind is that choosing an architecture should not be a religious decision. And clean architecture does happen to have a lot of fanboys and people who are just, this has got to be because this is the way it's written in the book. I'm here to tell you this doesn't have to be a religious topic. The principles that are taught with clean architecture are common throughout software development. These are not .NET specific. And what we're going to use for our names are suggestions. They're not hard and fast guidelines. The way the architecture is structured, that's where the guidelines will get you in the right direction. But we're going to talk about why clean. And with it as old as it is, why is clean architecture still relevant? When do we use it? When shouldn't we use it? Then we'll get into the structure of clean architecture. Now, before we continue on with the rest of the list, I know some of you will see this list and go, well, that's a weird order. Wouldn't you want to tell us about it and then when it applies and when it doesn't apply? And the answer in that case is no. The reason why I take this approach is because I have run into so many people who have been like, oh, it's overly complicated. Want to know a secret? I was that person prior to working in Nimble Pros. I wondered, why would I want to follow an architecture so complicated? But the thing was, I wasn't looking at it in the right use case. I was working on simpler apps that didn't need it. So those of you who question, like, why do we have to use this? You don't have to, but you want to use it in the right times. So I want to make sure we understand why is it still relevant, when do we apply it, and then once we have all that, okay, now let's actually look at how does it work. We'll do a brief why.NET 10, and then we'll look at Ardalis' clean architecture templates, plural. So we'll talk about his standard one and his new one that he just released. And then we'll look at demos. Now, if as long as time allows, we're going to jump into code. But if time doesn't allow, if we're running short on time, I have slides for each of our demos. I don't like doing slides for demos just because we're devs. We like playing with code. But again, knowing our time, I have to be very clear. The things I'm not going to cover. So I'm not going to compare clean architecture versus modular monoliths or clean architecture versus hexagonal architecture. I did that in my clean architecture course. Don't need to rehash that here. We're not going to look at the history of the architectures and how they evolve. I have to give a shout out to Ardalis. He does a really good job of that in the .NET Conf presentation he gave. So I'll make sure to link to that. But we're not going to do that here. I'm not going to get in depth with looking at the underlying principles of clean architecture. We will mention the principles, but I'm not going in depth like, oh, this is called out here in this template and this is called out here. Again, I do that in my course. And then how clean architecture is implemented in non-C# languages. This is about .NET 10. Let's go. So first, let's talk about clean architecture. Why clean? Well, when we think about the term clean architecture, the clean part means that the code's going to be well organized. There's a clear separation of concerns. The code is maintainable. We're separating the business logic from the external details. You'll hear me say that often when I'm talking about clean architecture. It's one of my favorite features about this is that I can change my core logic, and it's not necessarily going to be that you can change the core logic, but I don't have to necessarily change it in all different layers. The logic lives in the logic layer. I could change the UI without having to change the logic. So let's say that I have a Blazor UI, or maybe it's Blazor server, Blazor WebAssembly, it doesn't matter. But maybe I got tired of Blazor, went just to Razor pages. Doesn't matter. Core doesn't change, that logic is still going to be the same. I'm separating my business from my technical. It's so awesome. And it's testable. When you think of the clean part of clean architecture, you should be thinking about 3 goals here, which is low friction, low noise, high clarity. That said, if you're trying to use clean architecture on a project and you're running into a lot of friction, or you're just getting into a pattern and you're like, there's just a lot going on here and it doesn't feel right, maybe you're like, this is just all muddled and chaotic and I can't make sense of it, it might not be the right fit for that particular project. So keep in mind that having those feelings, that's fine. I'm not here to tell you you have to use this. I'm here to tell you how you can use this. Now, why is this still relevant? This was introduced back in 2012. The book came out in 2017. So this has been around quite a while. But the thing is, those problems aren't going away. So apps are still going to get tangled. You're still going to see domain and data and UI, and you still see developers who tend to mix them, and it gets gross to maintain. You also see teams that are struggling with testability because, again, things get embedded everywhere. So I need to test logic. Well, where is it? It's in my controller. It's in models. It's in components. Or it's in a non-testable spot, like, oh, it's in a stored procedure. Ugh. And I think of crimes I committed as a young developer. I see these pains very well. But I also understand how clean architecture can lead us down the better path for some of these projects. And so let's talk about when to use clean architecture and when not to use clean architecture. So understand that clean architecture does not fit every project. See this bridge? See this bridge? What is this over? This is way overkill. Clean architecture can be way overkill on projects. And this is where we get the people who complain, well, this doesn't fit my project and it's just awful because it never works. Well, you might just have the wrong projects for this. Don't try to force something here that isn't going to necessarily work. Don't do clean architecture just to say you've done it. Make sure it's the right application. If you're doing a small CRUD tool, or if you're using scripts or utility apps, like I wouldn't use clean architecture with my PowerShell scripts. No way. Overkill. For proofs of concept, or proof of concepts, depending on how you're building it, clean architecture may very well be overkill. Now that said, if you're in a startup environment and you're working on a project that could grow into clean architecture and you don't want to have to throw it all away, it might make sense. Clean architecture with rapid prototypes, again, might not make sense. This last point I need to stress. When the complexity lives in the data, then clean architecture may not necessarily make sense. But when the complexity is in the behaviors, it's in the business rules, the business logic, then it might make sense. So again, I know the frustrations that I hear with people using the template of, this feels complicated, it feels complex, it feels just so too much. And the thing is, it very well may be for the project that you're working on. Now that said, where does it make sense then? So it fits in things where there's hard business rules. Again, keep in mind the whole separating the business from the technical decisions. Another case is for long-lived domains. If you're doing domain-driven design, something like clean architecture could make sense. If you have a project that has multiple interfaces, and when I say interfaces, You're going to hear interfaces in this presentation, and I'll have interfaces with asterisks because it's not the interface of public interface, interface name. It's not that we're talking about. We're talking about interfaces sometimes as GUIs. In this case, it could be an API. It could be a web app, could be a console app, a terminal UI like what we saw in .NET Conf. It could be mobile apps, it could be integrations with these apps, all these different interfaces and how they all combine. Clean architecture works well with larger teams. And it also works well for if you've got projects that have systems with regulatory and consistency requirements. Those are typically larger applications as well. Again, if you're dealing with smaller applications and a pretty simple business setup, you might not need a clean architecture. All right, so let's talk about the clean architecture structure. It's built on 4 principles. So the 4 principles we're going to look at briefly is separation of concerns. So again, you don't want to mix things that are not really related together and put them in one big box. Or in this example, you don't want to put your cleaning supplies in your fridge. Who does that? They did for this picture. The single responsibility principle. So having a classroom module should have one and only one reason to change. This goes similar to like CA's layers, where each layer has their distinct purpose. Dependency inversion. So this you'll see here when we get into the layers and finding how the layers depend on each other. How it's the inside doesn't know about the external, but the external can deal with the internal. We'll show that here shortly. And then there's the explicit dependencies, so being clear as to what it needs. Again, this is critical for clean architecture. So these are the 4 principles. Not going into heavy details of where this aligns, but just know that these are the base. Okay, so let's talk about the clean architecture overview. So it's a software design philosophy, essentially. Making your code more maintainable, more testable, more scalable. It works with the concentric circles. So core, this is the innermost layer. This is your entities. This is your domain logic. This is your business logic. So if you have business rules, business behaviors, they're going to be at the core level. The next layer is going to be use cases, or the application layer. So this is application specific business rules. Again, we're still talking about business rules on this part. So where business rules core is like your main, these are the rules. Use cases are, okay, now these are getting more toward application specific. The use cases does know about core. The next layer is infrastructure. They call them interfaces. I asked this to be clear what the interfaces are. The interfaces, see it as it's an adapter layer, essentially, where your external can work with your interfaces and lower. However, like core does not know about infrastructure, core does not know about use cases, and core won't know about external either. The interfaces is that bridge between the external and the internal. And then we have our frameworks and our drivers. And with the frameworks and the drivers, what you're seeing here, so this is the external components. You'll hear me mention web because web is a common demo. But it's not just web, it's any of your UIs that I mentioned earlier. So your APIs, your TUIs, which are your terminal UIs, your web UIs, your not just website, but also API. That's another interface as well. So these are the different layers of clean architecture. Now, the thing you don't see yet are the dependencies. So let's look at those. There they are. And they're drawn that way on purpose. And the reason is because you got external going in. The frameworks can see all these layers. Infrastructure can see all the inner layers. Use cases knows about core, but core doesn't know about these. Now you might be like, but what if my code really needs me to cross the boundaries? Well, I'm going to go back to the story of it depends. Does it really need to go across the boundaries? Is it a cross-cutting concern? Those are handled differently. However, if it's something where core needs to rely on frameworks, needs to rely on, like if they have an internal dependency that they rely on each other like that, we need to consider restructuring the code. Because the thing is, you don't want those layers to be crossing those boundaries if you can avoid it. And so it might just be a matter of having a conversation with others to go, how do I avoid it? All right, so your business logic is in the core layer. So in core, it could also be in use cases if it's more behavior driven, closer to the UI. The dependencies, they flow inward toward core. And again, this is just to make sure that, hey, this is how this all works. This is a rule. This is not a guideline. So the keeping the layers separated and the layers only know about certain things, that's part of the whole clean architecture rules. They are hard and fast. But what we call them, so you'll see that we call core typically. So in one of the examples, you'll see that in a folder called domain. So there are different terms. You'll find the terms that you use make sense for your environment. Now you might be wondering, so the theme is clean architecture with .NET 10. Why .NET 10? Well, .NET 10, C# 14, Aspire 13, all the versions, none of them are the same number, thanks Microsoft. But they just released it. And the thing that I'm pushing with .NET 10 is that this is the long-term support release. So the long-term support release means 3 years of support. And so that means those that were in .NET 8 no longer supported. So we want to kind of update those. Our .NET 9 apps, we also want to update to .NET 10. And Ardalis updated the clean architecture template for .NET 10. These updates include things for .NET 10 include performance improvements, cryptography, numerics, globalization, and more. Passkey support in ASP.NET. I'm a little bit excited about that. Blazor WASM preloading, enhanced form validation. There's a lot more in it. I'm not going through the full list. Aspire and more. With Aspire, I do want to point out that it has more polyglot support, so you'll see Python and JavaScript, and they changed their name. It's not .NET Aspire, it's just Aspire. So why .NET 10? It's because it is the new long-term support release, so it's going to be the stable one to go with eventually. I say eventually because we know that updates don't necessarily just happen. One does not simply update to a major release. All the .NET 10 announcements are available through .NET Conf 2025. I've included a bit.ly to make it a little bit easier because the YouTube URL is kind of gross. And get .NET 10. So the demos I'm going to show here are running .NET 10. Something else to keep in mind, because I want you to learn from my mistakes, is make sure you update your tools. This is not just an SDK. This is not just Visual Studio 2026. There's a little more to it. And one does not simply just go into your directory packages, props, and change versions. There's a little bit more to it. For example, if you're using Aspire and the Aspire CLI, you want to make sure to update your tools. So make sure to do .NET Tool, install -g, aspire.cli. -g for global. If you're not doing it globally, remember to take off the -g. All right. So that's the .NET 10 stuff. We talked about the clean architecture stuff at a high level. Let's look at the template, and then we'll go into demos. Any questions so far? All right, if you have any questions, please post in chat or leave a note in the comments. We do read those. All right, so let's talk about Ardalis's clean architecture template. So Ardalis's clean architecture template is available on GitHub through Ardalis-clean architecture, but we'll show the .NET commands to install the templates. The first one we're going to talk about is Ardalis's clean architecture template. I say templates plural because we have another one to talk about also from Ardalis. But the standard clean architecture template, it just makes it easier because it's already got the layers scaffolded for us. It's got the core, it's got the use case, it's got the infrastructure, it's got the web. All that plumbing taken care of for us in a template. Now I have to stress it's an opinionated template, and there are comments throughout to explain, well, this is one way to approach it, and Ardalis likes to do it this way. So you'll see those in the template as well. It's a great way to learn how to structure it. You can run the template, which is important because then you can see, oh, look, the plumbing really does work. But then you can also change it, hence the template part. It does have insights on decisions that are already included thanks to the decision records. And that GitHub repo also has a sample folder. So if you want to see how to apply it in a bigger app, you can look at the sample folder. But the template itself does not have that sample anymore. Now, what's new in version 11? I'm going to call it v11x because it's now version 11.0, but minors and patches, I mean, with .NET 10 just dropping, we're going to find little gotchas here and there. So this template has been recently updated to .NET 10. Something to note with the changes is it is now using Martin Othamar's mediator for the mediator pattern, which uses source generators. This also means we're no longer relying on mediator, as in Jimmy Bogart's. So that's the big call out I want to make sure of. Now, that said, this template is open source. This is not just Ardalis behind it. Yes, Ardalis' name is on it. However, we've got a great community who's offering to support the template as best as they can. And it's not just NimblePro's people either. Yes, we work with Ardalis. Yes, we can help with maintaining these, but it's not just us. And so I want to make sure, like last year when I did the presentation on clean architecture, this year I want to do that again. We're calling out those who contributed and helped make the template where it is today. So first I want to give a shout out to Saman Azadi. I apologize if I butcher any of the names. A name like Serdukevich, you know I understand that all too well. But Saman, he contributed to the contributing.md and updated it to point to the correct repo names. So thank you for that change. Contributing.md is a good way to see how to contribute to a repo so that you too can contribute to open source if you feel like it. Alfredo Torre. So Alfredo updated the README to include a link to the hexagonal architecture documents on Alistair Coburn's site. And Kyle McMaster, he is a NimblePro. He helped with the pipeline updates, and the key here is to note that in the CI/CD, you'll see that setup-.net is now at v5. And last, but certainly not least, is Samson Wuzugby. And Samson's update is a domain event dispatch interceptor. So the way this works is we're going to invert the dependency of appdb context on the event dispatcher by creating an EF core interceptor that retrieves the entities and dispatches the events after save changes has completed successfully. So EF core has interceptors for a few different parts of its lifecycle, which allows you to then tap into those points and be able to inject your own code. So pretty neat. I'll show you that when we get into the code. Okay, so how do you get started with Ardalis' template? First, you want to install it. So the command is .NET new install ardalis.cleanarchitecture.template. This will install the latest version. If you already have it installed on your machine, a previous version, and then you run this command, that'll get the latest version. Now, once you have the template installed, then you can just do a .NET new clean-arch and then -o and give it a name. So in my example, I called it Clean Architecture Demo. Really not creative. Did I mention I'm a developer sometimes? So naming things, it's not creative. It's something I do still need to point out, unfortunately. When you're dealing with your names for your projects, for your .NET New Clean Arch, do not put any hyphens in the names. That's a Microsoft issue that still doesn't seem to be fixed yet. So your project name, make sure it does not have hyphens. Dots are okay, hyphens, not so much. All right, you know what? We're okay on time. We're going to go to the demo. So I am going to open up my Visual Studio Code. And if you're wondering why I'm using Visual Studio Code and not Visual Studio 2026, it's because I live in Visual Studio Code for my development all day. It just is a lot easier. And we're going to open up my clean architecture demo, and then we'll switch over there so you can see what we're looking at. Okay. There's the laptop. So we are in the clean architecture demo. This is the thing that got created when I told it to create a new clean architecture demo with that .NET new command. And so you can see we've got an Aspire folder, we've got source and tests, and then a bunch of other files. Now, we want to take a look at the clean architecture layers behind all of this. Oh yeah, and there's tests. The tests, did I mention testability is a feature? All right, so let's look at source. I'm going to collapse that because I know some of these are already open. So we have Aspire hosts and service defaults are for .NET Aspire side of things with this project. Those are not related to the clean architecture. Those are just scaffolding on the outside. Technically, you could consider those as external if you wanted to look at it that way. Then there's core. So core is our domain logic. And what do we have going on in there? So, you know what? Hold on. This might make more sense if we run it and then we look at the layers. Since I know Aspire is here, I'm going to use the Aspire CLI. I'm going to tell it Aspire run. And I know it's going to look weird with the paths and stuff. I'm working on a zoomed in font so you can see what's going on. And we'll bring that down so you can see what's going on there. Okay. So this is the clean architecture template. It runs right when you create a new project. Love templates that run because then you go, oh, okay, hardware is good, everything seems to be okay. The URL that we see here, oh, there we go, is called Scalar. So instead of using Swagger, they're using Scalar. This is an API. And then you see that we have a SQL server, and we also have Papercut. Papercut is used for mailing, for if you have emails, hence port 25. So let's take a look at Scalar, just so you can see the API behind the scenes, or on the front end in this case. What does it look like? So we can list our contributors with pagination, and we can delete a contributor, create a contributor. These are contributors to an open source project like the template. And so you can see we've got the what's going on, we have a description, we have our query parameters. I can say let's go ahead and test the request. So let's list it. And there's my contributors, and I'm just going to tell it to send. And so you can see here's our unpaged because I didn't pass any of that stuff in. By default, it's going to take 1 and 10. Now I could say 1, but let's say I only want to go 5 per page. So you've seen that. I tell it send 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So we're getting 5 per page. So it's not Swagger. This is Scalar. We'll take a look at Scalar again when we look at the other template, because both templates use Scalar. But I just wanted to show you behind the, or what's actually running. So you have an idea of, okay, well, we've got contributors. I'm going to go back here. So that was listing. If I want to get a contributor by ID, and I want to get the contributor to be 2, let's get Ileana. And send. See, there's Ileana. So, I mean, it's a busy interface, to say the least, because you need to know what you're looking at and where things are. But on a smaller laptop screen, that is a little more chaotic. You can do things here. So I could say, there's the body. I'd say, to Ileana. And I think the other one was what? Phone number? A phone number, and that's camel case. I could say here, phone number 75309. No, that's not a real phone number if you know the song. Yeah. Details. Okay. So you can see that this runs. That's just a data issue on my part. All right, so we've got contributors. We're adding, deleting, and changing details. Let's look at our code. So the core, that's the business logic. This is where we get into things like our contributor aggregate. So domain-driven design and aggregates are things that we deal with here often. I actually used clean architecture on a project where we didn't understand the domain just yet, that we didn't feel confident enough to make modules and modular monolith. We just started with clean architecture and kind of evolved. And we do have something similar where it's a entity or an aggregate, and then we have our events. And then here we've got in the cores where the handlers are, and then specifications. As I mentioned, this is an opinionated template, so we're using Ardalis specifications. This is another one where I see people go, but do I really need to use them? The answer is no. This is a template. This gives you a starting point, but you can go ahead and then make those changes and go, you know what, I don't need this anymore. Take that out. So if the specification thing doesn't make sense for you, then go ahead and don't deal with it. But we use it. It makes things a little more testable. So in our aggregate, that's what you see going on here. And then we have our contributor itself. Now, that said, this is the contributor. You don't see the data relationships. Data relationships are stored over in the infrastructure. The core is just the business logic. So I've got, when my contributor is deleted, I just need to track that. So that's why I have that event. Or if a contributor's name is updated, maybe the phone number code isn't actually in here yet. I got a little too excited. But you can see here, then there's the handler, and then there's the other handler. And notice on the handlers, this is how they work, where they've got their send email async. For example, when you've updated, you deleted, we're going to send email async. So that's what's going on in this code. Code itself works. But from a clean architecture standpoint, this is your core, is where the aggregate is. This is where you're going to see those interfaces without the asterisk. So email sender, for example, is you're going to see two different implementations, but those implementations don't live in core. The implementations have a bunch of plumbing in there, so that's going in infrastructure. So we'll show those. And then the delete contributor service. Just so you can see that sometimes in core, you'll have both interfaces and services that happens. And so you can see how this works here. And then there are comments throughout the template to explain, like, why did we make this decision? So you can understand why some of the things are here at the core layer versus other layers as well. That's core. The next case, or the next layer, is going to be use cases. I only know that it's not it's not in their order. It's alphabetical, but I know this because I talk about clean architecture enough to know the order. So with the use cases, what's going on in there? I'll close that. We'll look at our contributors. So the way this particular thing is organized, I'm going to call out the organization because it changes somewhere else. This goes back to it's not a hard and fast how do you organize it. You might have it where it's broken down where the action has its own folder. So the contributors, there's a create, there's a delete, there's a get, a list, and update. They each have their own folders. You'll see it in another example where we get that's just gone and everybody's all in one folder. Go with the organization that makes sense for your project and for your team. For use cases, so we use CQRS, or the command query command. There's commands and queries and the responses, so you can see queries are when you're getting things, so getting by an ID or listing all, for example. Commands are you're doing stuff, so you're creating, you're updating, and you're deleting, for example. So we've got our create command and its handler, another command and handler. Now, I want to show you something with this. So the commands, our commands, they implement the iCommand interface, just so you can see. We are using Ardalis result in here as well. Again, goes back to the opinionated template. So if it doesn't make sense, again, you can take that out. However, if you want more testable endpoints and handlers, that can help too. All right, so here's our handler. Then you can see here, there's the logic and then the return on that. So that's what's going on in use cases. We have a lot of commands and queries. You'll see that that's where our data transfer objects live as well. So we have a contributor DTO. Our DTOs typically tend to be records. You can see what's going on in here. All right, so we've looked at core, we've looked at use cases. The next layer is going to be our infrastructure. So core doesn't know about any of these other ones. Use cases can know about core. And just so you can see in the project file that we do reference core in our use cases. So pointing inwards. Actually, let me show no tricks up my sleeve, as I usually do for the project. So we are looking at a clean architecture core project file. Notice there's package references, but there are no project references. Core doesn't know about web. It doesn't know about infrastructure. It doesn't know about use cases. That's all normal. All right, so we did core, we did use cases, showed use cases, talks to core, infrastructure. So infrastructure, this is where I call it, this is where the plumbing lives. This is where you're going to find things like the EF core details. So if we go into configs, so you can see here's all of your relationships, all of your configuration files for your EF core entities would go in infrastructure. He uses Vogen for his value object generation. So that's Steve Dunn's Vogen project. And so he's got some converters in here as well. Again, notice EF core converters. So we're talking anything EF core wise is here, not just EF core, but also email. The other thing, so that's config. There's migration. So if you use EF core's migrations feature, that's where they live. He's got some queries in here as well. So query service, again, to give you ideas of what could live in infrastructure. Now email, this goes back to where infrastructure can call back to core. So infrastructure, we've got our fake email sender and our MimeKit email sender. So you can see they both implement email sender dependency injection. Choose the one you want to use. There's mail server, MimeKit. So there are different ways that you can approach this as well. But that's stuff that requires plumbing and infrastructure. Now, I make the comment plumbing and infrastructure. Let's look at infrastructure service extensions. Because this is an iService collection extension, which means that when you're registering these things in program.cs or app.cs or startup.cs or even whatever your .cs file is named, now that we have file-based options as well, this is where you do your configuration. Now, this is where we mentioned that there was, no, what's that for now? We mentioned that there's a contribution with interceptors, an EF core interceptor, and how it ties into the saved and triggering the domain events. So this is where you're seeing that interceptor. Right here on line 29 in the infrastructure service extensions. See, this is where it gets wired up. This gets wired up in the infrastructure service extension. Now you might be wondering, but why there? That's where the plumbing lives. You want one iService collection extension thing to handle registering all those services where it makes sense. Then there's, of course, logic here for toggling between SQL Server and SQLite. And all our dependency injection things that make sense in terms of repositories and services that live within infrastructure. All right. Of course, global usings and README to talk about the layers, but again, to show what's going on with infrastructure. Again, there's Vogen for the value object generation. So infrastructure knows about core, infrastructure knows about use cases. So then the last layer, so we talked about core, we talked about use cases, we talked about infra. Now let's talk about web. What goes on in web? Well, in this particular example, the web is an API. But you could have different layers as well. So you could have a web project. Maybe you don't have a web project. Maybe you have a terminal UI project. You're using something like Spectre Console or Terminal GUI or Razor Console. And so you've got a cool command line interface, a graphical interface in a terminal. That could be a thing. Or maybe you've got a Razor application that's consuming the API, or a Razor application that didn't have the API but is still working with all the other layers. Maybe you have a Blazor application. Maybe you have a .NET MAUI application or a hybrid application of some sort. The thing of the matter is, your web is your external. Your external can know about all the other layers, but your core doesn't care. Your core does not care what you choose for your UI. The business logic is still going to be the same regardless of how you present it to the user. Now, the user experience is going to differ because user experience on a phone versus a laptop versus a mobile kiosk at a store are all going to be different. But the business logic doesn't change. And that's why clean architecture makes sense in this case, because you've got your core business logic separated from the technical concerns of like your EF core or what mail provider you choose. So yeah, with this case, with the web, just so you can see how things are working, there's contributors. There's the contributor record, there's create, delete. And remember how I mentioned earlier that you could have folders for each of the different actions? In this section, there's no folders. And you might be going, oh, consistency, it would be nice. It would be nice. But the thing is, we don't want to lock you into you have to use folders. You can use just naming conventions. And what's nice with some of the tools like Visual Studio, for example, you'd be able to collapse the delete, because it would be delete and then delete contributor request.cs and delete contributor validator.cs. They collapse nicely in the Solution Explorer. Visual Studio Code, not so much, but I wanted to point out that, look, there's a create, there's delete, there's get by ID, there's list, there's update. The folders aren't there. So for those of you who are like, do we have to have those folders? The answer is no. Do we have to have our namespaces going down to those actions? No. As you can see here, for example, on list, namespace stopped at contributors. These are decisions that you should make for your organization, for the project you're on, where it makes sense with the team that you're working with. Lots of factors going on there, and that's what happens. That's why there's no folders here. It gives you the idea to go, oh, that's another approach. It does have an HTTP file. And so if we had Aspire running, then we should be able to run, send the request, and then get our responses. So anytime you have an API, if you deploy an HTTP file with it, that way it makes it easier for people to see how it works. But yeah, your endpoints are here then, so you can see we're using fast endpoints, and of course there's results. And if you're just like, well, what's results? I'll show you what results are. Results should be with a result. There's delete. So again, this is working with your different results. Could be no content, could be not found. Could come back with a problem HTTP result. You can see it's okay. This comes back with a record. Awesome. So when it comes to clean architecture, in a case like this, it makes sense because your business logic is isolated from your technical decisions. And it's a beautiful thing. You don't have everything weaved into each other and you're like, okay, I need to change business logic. Where do I need to change it? I should change it in the website. I should change it in use cases and core and in the database where my stored procedure. No, let's not get that carried away. All right, so we looked at core and use cases, and we looked at infrastructure, and I pointed out the infrastructure service extensions. And then there's web, and again, in the slides, I even called out that those folders do not exist. If we look again in this section, no folders. I'm getting twitchy about it because I prefer folders, but you don't have to. And again, these templates are built to run. So right after you do a .NET new clean-arch -o in your project name without hyphens, you can just run it. And I'm running it through Aspire's CLI. So Aspire space run, and it finds the Aspire files, and it runs like it's supposed to. Doesn't require a lot. Now, I have to stress that you've got the template as a guide, but you can bring your own code or bring in the structures as needed. And if a pattern doesn't make sense for your needs, do not need to follow it. The patterns we show in the template are patterns that we use in our projects in day-to-day. But I'm going to let you in on a secret. And shh, don't tell the boss man. Or he's probably watching this too. But the thing is, we don't necessarily use all the patterns all the time. It goes back to the other shirt I sometimes wear, which is it depends. Certain patterns might be overkill for your environment, and if it's overkill, don't do it. Keep in mind though, with clean architecture, it's those rules of the layers and being that the external can know about the internal, but the internal should not know about the external. That's the fundamental rule of clean architecture. That you can't break. Otherwise, you're not doing clean architecture, you're doing something else. You might be thinking you're doing clean architecture, but you're doing a disservice to yourself. But remember, outside can know about inside, but inside should know the outside. Now, if you're anything like how I was when I first saw clean architecture, this is how I felt, which was so many projects, so much code. Oh my gosh, why does it have to be this complicated? And do we really need all these projects? And the answer is no, you don't. Want to see something cool? Now, at the time of this presentation, I don't know that this has come out of beta yet. It might be, and if it did, it came out of beta maybe during this presentation. So, what I'm going to show you is new stuff. Really new stuff. Such cool new stuff. This is Ardalis' Clean Architecture Minimal Template. You're probably like, minimal template? You mean it doesn't have to be this complicated? It doesn't have to have so many projects and so many guides? Well, the guides are still there, but you don't need to have so many projects. So this was released in November of 2025. That's now. And it reduces the complexity by using this single project vertical slice architecture approach. You're like, wait, are we doing clean architecture? Are we doing vertical slices? Yes, we're doing both. So the core principles are in that minimal template. So you're going to see that it's still simplistic. Unnecessary abstractions, project boundaries that are giving trouble, you get rid of those. For vertical slices, we're organizing by feature rather than technical layer. That said, when we look at the template, I'll walk you through how things change. It is pragmatic domain-driven design, so you're using domain patterns where they add value, not everywhere. And I know a lot of you are like, Sudoku, we know that you like to keep it simple where you can. But when it comes to these templates, aren't they a little more overcomplicated? They don't have to be. This minimal template, I'm so excited about this. So the progressive enhancement, you start simple and then add complexity only when needed. And I wouldn't even call it complexity necessarily. Add the tools you need without making it too complex to maintain. So your clean architecture is still maintained. You still have dependency inversion. The domain doesn't depend on infrastructure directly. You still have testability. The business logic still is isolated. Your separation of concerns, there's still separation there, I promise you. We'll show you that. And it isn't necessarily coupled to ASP.NET Core. Your ASP.NET Core is your web UI, is your front end. The domain logic doesn't need to know whether you've got a web front end of an API. It doesn't need to know if you've got Blazor, if you've got Razor. It doesn't care. The domain logic is going to be your class libraries, your C# straight up. Now with this minimal template, there's simplifications. So there's a single project. One project! I am so excited. And it's all code in one web project instead of 4+ projects. It's simplified domain-driven design. And mediators, optional. Logic can live in the endpoints. You can use DB context directly or simple repositories instead of going with a complex repository pattern. Did I mention clean architecture doesn't have to be complicated? Did I tell you I had something cool to show you? And we're grouping by feature. So you'll see carts and orders and products by layer. How do you get started? First, you're going to do a .NET new install ardalis.minimalclean.template. Then when you do that, instead of doing clean-arch, for the minimal clean architecture, you use min-clean. So it's .NET new min-clean-o. Same deal, your project name without the hyphens. That's the way it rolls. You'll see something like it's created successfully. I mentioned I'm a wee bit excited about this. I'm gonna get my Visual Studio Code open. Our new minimal. Clean architecture does not have to be 10 billion projects and a lot of work. All right, let's go back to the code. All right, so we're in our VS Code. And this part is where it's awesome because this is our minimal clean architecture demo. There's the Aspire folder, which means, hey, we've got Aspire running. I'm using Aspire CLI. There's the Aspire host and the service defaults. And look, there's a web. There's a web without other projects. And you might be worrying like, oh no, everything in one project, is that okay? The answer is yeah. Because remember, we're doing a vertical slice architecture approach to clean architecture by sticking in one project. We've got our cart features and our product features. Those are our features, those are our slices. If we expand our cart features so you can see, there's our add to cart. Look, there's an endpoint and a handler. Same deal for checkout, same for get by ID. Our DTO, I'm going to collapse these again so you can see that our DTO and its response both live in the feature folder. So DTO's feature folder, they moved from use cases to the feature folder. Handlers are also from the use cases to the feature folder, and they're broken down. Endpoints, so those move from the web project in here, but they're still in the feature folder. They're just grouped together now. We have our domain. So when you see the domain folder in this minimal template, think of it as this is equivalent to core. So this is where you're seeing the aggregates, your specifications, your models, your interfaces. There's email sender. We have our cart aggregate, for example, with its specifications. So get the cart by ID. Product should have more interesting things. So specifications, there's a product by ID. So that's what's going on in here. There's our interfaces. So domain, when you see domain in the minimal clean architecture template, think of that as similar to core. Use cases goes to the features folders. That's where the DTOs also have gone, that were in use cases. Infrastructure has its own folder. So clean architecture does not need to be a lot of projects. You can do it all in one project and then use folders to organize into the different layers. The trick to knowing this is keeping in mind where things live and being respectful that things don't talk to each other. Working in one project, it is so tempting for older brains, especially those of us who've been working at this a while, to go, oh, it's all in the same project. We can just refer directly to them. No. Remember the rules of clean architecture with the layers and the separation of concerns? We need to keep that in mind. So we've got your data. Look, there's our migrations. There's our EF core configs. And yes, there's our event dispatcher. There is our infrastructure service extensions. So even though infrastructure is no longer in a project, all of it is still captured here in this folder. So what you're looking at with this minimal template Less fuss with the headaches of the projects and going, oh, how many projects do I have to keep track of? And yes, I know they have different responsibilities, but why is it organized this way? Yeah, that's what's going on in here. Is there anything else I need to show with this part? Talked about core. Use cases are now in features. I show the cart features and the product features. The infrastructure goes into a folder. You can use folders and namespaces to organize the code. We can run the template. So let's go back to my VS Code here. And let's go ahead and run it. Just by run. I love when I can run these demos live so that you can see that this is for real. Oh, this is our minimal clean architecture demo. Something I want to point out here too. Don't go to this URL, like the +1 for web. That's where the scaler is. This one also is another API. And so we could say get a product by ID, for example, and you can see how this works. It details it very nicely, gives you the responses. Something else I wanted to point out was at the top. You can tell the client library, so you can choose which library you have. So I'm going to say that I'm using the HTTP client and C#. And the reason I want to point that out is because, again, another feature of Scalar is, look, you get the sample code, so we have an idea. And I could change it over here too and be like, no, you know what, I want to use REST sharp. What does that syntax look like? So we've got our Scalar demo. This, again, is our minimal clean architecture. And as you saw with our demo, it is all down into one project. Plus the 2 for Aspire. Details. All right, so we looked at the clean architecture template from Ardalis. I did not show the clean architecture sample just due to time. I wanted to show the miniature one, our miniature clean architecture template first. So the sample itself, if you go to the clean architecture repo, you'll see a sample folder, and that way you can see how that works. Now, if you want to learn more about .NET 10 and clean architecture, in .NET 10, I mentioned .NET Conf for clean architecture. If you're brand new and want to deep dive into any of the topics we covered for the principles or for the different layers, I get into more depth in this course introducing clean architecture. So that's on Nimble Pros Academy. And if you're interested in either implementing clean architecture in your code or upgrading to .NET 10, if you like event storming and need a facilitator, anything we can do to help, please consider reaching out. All right, thank you all for coming today to learn more about clean architecture with .NET 10. I hope it helped. I hope you enjoyed being able to see both clean architecture template from Ardalis as well as the new one, the minimal clean architecture. So happy coding ahead, and I will see you next month. We will be doing a webinar on advanced testing techniques. So thank you again for joining us, and I hope to see you next month. Happy coding!